Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really digging into a pivotal moment. We're looking at how the National Democratic Party fundamentally reshaped itself back in the 1990s.
Yeah, this is a really crucial period. The core idea we're exploring, based on our sources, isn't just that the Democrats moved to the center, it's that they, systematically adopted what people call neoliberalism or the third way.
Right. So our mission here is to unpack that, to find the actual evidence, look at the institutional changes, the mechanics of it all, and the big policies that really show this shift happening, this move away, supposedly, from their old commitments to labor, to helping the poor.
Exactly. We're zeroing in on the Clinton presidency, so roughly 93 to 2001. And the stakes are pretty high because the argument in the material is that this shift really fundamentally, maybe even severed the party's historical ties to its working class base.
And those are ripples we're definitely still feeling today politically. So our goal is to lay out the context, the architecture, how they build this new approach, and then the actual policy results.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And, to really get why this happened, we can't just jump into 1993 when Clinton took office. We have to look back a bit at the political climate before that, the 80s, really.
Okay.
Because, major political parties don't just overhaul themselves for no reason. There had to be a sense of crisis, a feeling that the old way just wasn't working anymore.
Right, a need for change. So let's start there. Section 1. The context, the crisis. Okay, so setting the stage. The sources are pretty clear that the 1980s created this immense pressure cooker. The Democrats' traditional playbook, New Deal economics, government spending, strong social programs.
Yeah, that whole model was increasingly seen, rightly or wrongly, as failing by the late 70s. Couldn't manage the economy, people felt.
Okay.
And that perception, it opened the door wide for Ronald Reagan and the whole conservative movement.
And it wasn't just vibes, was it? The economic numbers were rough.
Oh, absolutely. The data was stark. Like, if you look at the summer of 1980, just before Reagan's election, unemployment under Carter hit 7.8% in July. That's over 8 million people officially out of work?
Wow.
Add high inflation to that, the whole stagflation nightmare and this general feeling of national decline. It convinced a lot of powerful people within the Democratic Party that their platform was just politically toxic.
Especially the parts focused on protecting unions and expanding welfare.
Exactly. They felt that stuff wasn't just failing economically, it was failing electorally. It couldn't win national elections anymore.
So it wasn't just one bad election loss. It felt like a fundamental failure of that kind of liberalism, leading to those huge defeats, like Mondale getting crushed by Reagan in '84.
Precisely. And that defeat really galvanized the folks who became the New Democrats. They looked at the wreckage and said, okay, the old way is dead nationally.
And what was their diagnosis? What was wrong with the old way, according to them?
Their argument, and you see this phrase in the source material, was that the party was overly focused on special interests and group politics.
Interesting phrase. What did they mean by special interests?
Well, it was, let's be frank, often a way to talk about organized labor, civil rights groups, anti-poverty advocates, painting them as these narrow groups, not the broad economic core of the party.
So distancing themselves from their traditional base.
In a way, yes, or at least recasting the relationship. The goal, the whole strategy, was about winning back those voters who'd fled to the Republicans.
The white, middle class, often suburban voters.
Yeah.
The Reagan Democrats.
Exactly. And how do you win them back? The New Democrat strategy was sound tough on crime, strong on defense, and critically sound fiscally conservative.
Okay, so that meant talking about things like deficit reduction, maybe even deregulation.
Absolutely. Making deficit reduction a top priority. Embracing policies friendly to the financial sector. It was a deliberate signal both to those middle-class voters and, importantly, to corporate America. The message was, we're not the party of tax and spend anymore.
Which immediately sets up this tension, doesn't it? Because those kinds of policies focusing on finance, on capital, moving freely, often directly clash with the interests of, say, factory workers or unions.
That's the core conflict right there. They were choosing policies that arguably helped capital and the financial world, potentially at the expense of their traditional blue-collar supporters.
All in the name of winning.
That was the justification. The belief was you can't help anyone if you can't get elected. So some ideological commitments, like maybe robust labor protections, had to be adjusted. Sacrifice, some would say, for political survival and this new market-friendly approach.
So that feeling of crisis, that electoral imperative, that's the foundation for everything that follows with the third way.
Is the bedrock, yeah. Without that sense of existential threat in the 80s, the radical restructuring of the 90s probably doesn't happen.
Okay, so the motivation is clear. Crisis, need for change. But you need more than motivation. You need an organization, a structure to actually make this shift happen. How did they build that?
The sources talk a lot about the DLC, right? The Democratic Leadership Council.
The DLC is central. It's the institutional engine, you could say. And it wasn't some grassroots movement. It was founded deliberately in 1985, right after that Mondale landslide loss.
By party insiders.
Yes, by established figures who felt the party had drifted too far left since maybe the late 60s. They believed that brand of liberalism was associated with economic problems, maybe social instability in some voters' minds. The DLC's explicit job was to pull the party back towards the center.
And Bill Clinton becomes the face of this, right? He was involved early on.
Absolutely. A founding member, later chaired the DLC. He really embodied this emerging third way ideology. The challenge was, how do you sell it? How do you make this centrist shift sound appealing, both to the party faithful and to those swing voters?
So how did they package it? What was the messaging? The core values they pushed were opportunity, responsibility, and community. It was framed not as abandoning progressive goals, but as modernizing them for a new era.
Responsibility sounds like a key word there.
It was crucial. That emphasis on personal responsibility laid the groundwork, ideologically, for policies down the line, like welfare reform, which we'll get to. The DLC's pitch was essentially, we can be smart with money, friendly to markets, and still create social progress. Kind of have your cake and eat it, too, for those suburban voters they needed.
Okay, so you have the ideology, you have the organization, and the DLC. But making big changes like this takes money, serious money. And this is where things really seem to lock in, according to the sources. The Clinton era saw this huge shift in how the Democratic Party was funded.
Massive shift, a rapid acceleration towards relying on corporations and wealthy individuals. And the mechanism that really enabled this, that institutionalized it, was soft money.
We should probably explain soft money quickly. It's kind of jargony.
Yeah, good point. Basically, before campaign finance reforms really clamped down later, soft money was money given directly to the political parties themselves, not individual candidates. The idea was it was for party-building activities, get out the vote drives, issue ads, that kind of thing.
But the key was it wasn't subject to the same strict contribution limits as donations to specific campaigns were.
Exactly. So instead of being limited to giving, say, $1,000 to a candidate, a corporation or a wealthy person could write a check for $100,000, $500,000, even more, directly to the DNC or the RNC.
So this fundamentally changes who's paying the bills for the party machinery. Less reliance on, say, union contributions or small dollar donors.
And much, much more reliance on big checks from corporations and the super rich. This wasn't just about funding election campaigns. It was about funding the party's core operations. And the sources are clear. The scale during the Clinton years was just enormous.
How big are we talking?
The figures cited suggest the Clintons, across their national careers, helped raise something like $1.4 billion, with a huge chunk of that during the presidency coming through these soft money channels from wealthy donors and corporate interests, particularly the financial services sector.
And the DLC wasn't just pushing the ideology, it was connecting the money to the policy, acting as a bridge.
Absolutely. After Clinton won in '92, the DLC became a key channel for this new form of influence. It provided essentially high-level access for corporate lobbyists and executives in exchange for contributions.
Like those fundraising dinners the sources mentioned?
Exactly. Tables going for, say, $15,000. You pay that, you get face time with administration officials, with key policymakers. It formalized a system where corporate and financial interests had a much louder voice institutionally than, say, organized labor did.
It sounds like a feedback loop. The DLC promotes policies favorable to business.
Often developed through its think tank, the Progressive Policy Institute.
Right. And then businesses fund the DLC and the party, ensuring those policies stay on the agenda and giving them access.
Precisely. Pay to play, essentially, but institutionalized. Policy creation gets directly linked to corporate funding and high-dollar access.
And this financial shift mirrored a shift in the kind of people donating, too, right? Not just corporations, but individual donors.
Yeah, that's another fascinating point in the sources. They note that starting around the mid-90s, Democratic candidates began drawing more of their primary donations, the early money, from people living in highly educated, more affluent areas compared to Republicans.
So the party's elite donor base was becoming more professional class. Educated elites.
You can say that. And the consequence, the sources argue, is that the party's policy priorities naturally started to align more with the interests of that base. Things like financial deregulation, which benefited Wall Street, or trade deals, which might benefit professionals but hurt manufacturing workers. Maybe less focus on the traditional anti-poverty stuff.
So the stage is set. You've got the crisis pushing for change, the DLC providing the ideology and structure, and corporate money pouring in to solidify it. The next step is actually doing things, implementing the policies.
Exactly. Now we see the third way in action. Okay, so if the new architecture was in place, the first really big defining policy test of this Clinton-era third way had to be trade. Specifically, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Ah, NAFTA,
Yeah.
passed in '93. Yeah, that feels like the absolute litmus test because it just blew open the cracks within the Democratic Party, didn't it?
Completely. It was incredibly controversial. And the key thing is how it passed. It only got through Congress with massive support from Republicans and the business community.
Overcoming huge opposition from.
From organized labor. Unions fought it tooth and nail,
Yeah.
fiercely.
So you had a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, actively working with Republicans and corporations against the core interests of a major traditional Democratic constituency.
That's exactly what the sources highlight. The political effort involved was immense. Clinton had to twist a lot of arms, especially among moderate Republicans, and essentially break ranks with powerful Democrats like Dick Gephardt, who were strong labor allies. It sent a huge signal
What was the signal?
that when push came to shove, the administration's allegiance on this defining economic issue was now more aligned with the interests of, well, capital mobility and corporate expansion than with protecting domestic union jobs.
And the substance of NAFTA itself, what was it designed to do?
Structurally, it was about reducing barriers, tariffs, regulations to trade and investment between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. The practical effect, and arguably the intent for many corporations, was to make it easier for U.S. companies to move production facilities, especially manufacturing, to Mexico, where labor was cheaper.
And then sell the goods made there back into the U.S. market without tariffs.
Correct. It was essentially institutionalizing outsourcing for many sectors.
Which critics argued would inevitably hurt American workers.
Directly. By putting them in competition with lower-wage workers and making it easier for companies to threaten to move jobs if unions demanded too much. The estimates cited in our sources suggest NAFTA led to a net loss of maybe around 700,000 U.S. jobs over time.
And contributed to wage stagnation and inequality.
That's the argument, yeah, that it was a major factor in widening the gap. But maybe even more importantly, NAFTA wasn't just a one-off. It became the template.
The model for future trade deals.
Exactly. It set the pattern for how the Clinton administration and later administrations approached globalization. Things like pushing for the creation of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in its current form. And crucially, the effort later in the administration to grant China permanent normal trade relations, PNTR.
Right. Bringing China fully into the global trading system. That was also hugely controversial.
Hugely. And the sources suggest that MOVE, PNTR for China, had an even bigger impact, ultimately leading to the loss of millions more U.S. manufacturing jobs in the decade that followed. The commitment to free trade, to capital mobility, really became a core defining principle, overriding labor's concerns almost every time.
Okay, so that's trade, hitting the traditional manufacturing base. But you mentioned earlier the party was also cultivating this new, educated professional base. Did policy reflect their interests too?
It did. And a key example here is immigration policy, specifically high-skilled immigration. The H-1B visa program.
Ah, the visas for tech workers and other specialized professionals.
Exactly. This program really benefited the booming tech industry in the 90s, which was becoming a major source of campaign funding for the New Democrats. And in 1998, they passed the American Competitiveness and Workforce Improvement Act, or ACWIA.
What did that do?
It dramatically increased the annual cap on H-1B visas. Nearly doubled it, actually, from $65,000 a year up to $115,000.
And the justification was?
The official line was all about the needs of the new economy, addressing supposed shortages of high-tech skills, keeping America competitive, fueling innovation, all that stuff.
But what was the practical effect, according to the analysis?
Well, while it certainly helped tech companies get the talent they wanted, the functional impact, as the sources detail, was also to increase the supply of specialized labor, which tends to
Lower wages. Or at least suppress wage growth.
Exactly. It reduced the bargaining power of domestic high-skilled workers in those fields. So again, you see a policy choice that prioritizes the needs of the corporate donor base in this case. Tech companies wanting cheaper engineers or programmers potentially over the wage protection of American workers, even highly skilled ones.
So whether you're a factory worker facing NAFTA or a software engineer facing H-1B expansion, the structural direction seems similar. Weakening labor's position relative to capital, it makes the neoliberal shift argument look pretty strong.
It does build a strong case. But we have to acknowledge what the sources call the duality of the Clinton approach. They couldn't completely abandon the traditional base politically. They had to give them something.
Right, the concessions. What were the main ones?
Well, there are some significant symbolic and practical wins for labor and families. Clinton signed the Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA, right at the beginning in 1993. It was big.
Guaranteed unpaid leave for family or medical reasons. Yeah, that was popular.
Very. And he also oversaw 2 increases in the federal minimum wage in 96 and 97. Took it from $4.25 up to $5.15 an hour.
Okay, not huge, but an increase.
A nominal increase, yes.
Yeah.
And importantly, he also vetoed a bill called the TEAM Act in 1995. This was a Republican bill that unions absolutely hated, arguing it would allow companies to set up sham management-dominated unions. Clinton siding with labor on that was a big deal to them.
So FMLA, minimum wage bumps, vetoing the TEAM Act, those look like pro-labor moves. How do the sources square this with the overall neoliberal trend?
The analysis presented is basically that these were necessary political moves. They were important talking points, ways to reassure the base, provide some tangible benefits, and kind of maintain the appearance that the party still cared. Appeasement, maybe?
But fundamentally outweighed by the bigger structural changes.
That's the argument. When you weigh the FMLA, which is unpaid leave, and a 90-cent minimum wage increase over several years against the long-term structural impacts of NAFTA, PNTR for China, and the H-1B expansion, the sources argue the concessions were marginal by comparison.
And the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. What happened to union power overall?
The numbers are stark. Union membership density, which was already declining, continued to fall steadily through the 90s. It went from nearly 27% back in the late 70s down to just 15% by the year 2000.
15%? Wow.
Yeah. That decline is hard evidence that whatever concessions were made, the overall economic architecture being built was fundamentally weakening the position of organized labor in the American economy, which maybe made it easier politically for the party to continue drifting away from that base.
Okay, so we've seen the shift in economic policy, trade, labor. But the third way wasn't just about economics, was it? There was a major social policy component, too. And the big one, the defining one, seems to be welfare reform.
Absolutely. The Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, PRWA, commonly just called welfare reform. This is where that responsibility pillar of the DLC ideology really comes into play.
And this was huge politically, wasn't it? Clinton had campaigned on this promise to end welfare as we know it.
He did. It was a core pledge. Interestingly, it was also a cornerstone of the Republican contract with America that had helped them take Congress in '94.
So you had a Democratic president signing into law a policy that was also a top priority for Republicans, aimed at dismantling a key part of the social safety net. That really shows how much the center ground had shifted.
It really does. It shows the widespread acceptance of certain, market-oriented, fiscally conservative ideas across both parties by the mid-90s. PRWA fundamentally changed the nature of federal assistance to the poor.
How so? What did it actually do? It replaced the old system, AFDC.
Right, aid to families with dependent children.
Yeah.
AFDC had been around for 60 years, since the New Deal era. It was a federal entitlement. That meant if you met the criteria, basically being a poor family with kids, you were legally entitled to receive cash assistance from the federal government.
Guaranteed help.
Guaranteed, yes. PRWA got rid of that guarantee. It replaced AFDC with TANF, temporary assistance for needy families. And the name tells you a lot. Temporary.
So no longer an entitlement. What did TANF do instead?
Several key things that really injected market logic, or at least work requirements, into welfare. First, time limits.
Lifetime limit.
Yes, a 5-year lifetime limit on receiving federally funded cash assistance. The clock was ticking. The idea was to push people into the workforce because the safety net wouldn't be there forever.
Okay. What else?
Work requirements, what became known as workfare. Recipients generally had to start working or be in job training or actively looking for work after just 2 years of receiving benefits.
So you couldn't just receive aid. You had to be demonstrably trying to join the labor market.
Exactly. And they even changed the physical setup. The sources mention moving welfare assistance offices into job centers.
Symbolism matters.
Absolutely. The signal was clear. Welfare isn't a standalone support system anymore. It's now part of the system designed to get you a job. The focus shifted dramatically from poverty alleviation through cash aid towards mandated work.
And this ties directly back to that DLC responsibility theme.
Directly. The stated goals of PR WARA were explicit, and the dependence of needy parents on government benefits by promoting job preparation, work, and marriage. It was all about promoting self-sufficiency through work, the hand-up, not a handout idea.
Which, again, sounds very much like traditional conservative arguments against welfare.
It absolutely echoed those critiques.
Yeah.
By championing and signing this reform, Clinton and the New Democrats were signaling very clearly their commitment to fiscal discipline and, well, imposing a kind of market accountability onto the poorest citizens. It was a major break from the old New Deal promise.
A definitive marker of abandoning that guaranteed safety net principle.
Without a doubt. And the impact was immediate and dramatic. The number of families receiving cash welfare assistance plummeted after PR WARA passed.
How much?
The sources cite a reduction of over 60% in the years immediately following enactment.
60%? That's huge.
It's a staggering drop. It's undeniable proof of a massive, rapid contraction of that part of the social safety net. It confirms that the shift towards market-based solutions and fiscal austerity wasn't just talk. It had profound, measurable consequences for the nation's anti-poverty programs.
Okay, let's try to pull these threads together. We've looked at the context, the institutions, the policies. What's the overall picture that emerges from the sources? It seems like a pretty clear causal chain.
I think so. You start with the electoral defeats of the 80s, the sense of crisis. That leads to the rise of the DLC and this third way ideology.
Which then requires, or at least leads to, a much greater reliance on corporate and financial donors to fund the party and gain influence.
Right. And that reliance inevitably shapes the policy agenda. It prioritizes things that those donors and the targeted middle-class voters want, or at least accept, which gives you
NAFTA, expanding H-1B visas, financial deregulation trends, and ultimately welfare reform with PR WARA.
Exactly. And if you look for the common thread, the unifying principle across all those seemingly different policy areas, trade, immigration, social welfare.
What is it?
It seems to be prioritizing market forces, capital mobility, individual responsibility over collective guarantees, fiscal discipline.
Precisely. It's the core tenets of neoliberalism applied across the board, prioritizing market mechanisms over government intervention, focusing on individual accountability rather than societal safety nets, favoring capital movement over labor protection. It's a consistent pattern.
And the sources argue this wasn't just about tweaking policies to win an election or two. It was a fundamental realignment of the party's identity, creating this political economic schism.
Yeah. That's a key takeaway. This wasn't just a temporary tactic. It had deep, lasting consequences for the party's coalition. It clearly accelerated the drift of many traditional working-class voters away from the Democrats. They felt, quite reasonably perhaps, that the party no longer prioritized their economic concerns.
And Democratic strategists saw this happening. They did. And the sources suggest they made a conscious choice. They decided to focus their energy, their resources, on winning those middle-class suburbs, on appealing to the educated professional class voters. The party's internal staffing, its consultants, its think tanks, they increasingly reflected the worldview and economic interests of this new target demographic.
And here's the really interesting part of that schism, the paradox almost. This new base, the educated professionals. They might have agreed with the Democrats on social issues, cultural issues.
Right, often more liberal on those fronts.
But economically, they actually benefited from the very same neoliberal policies that were hurting the traditional blue-collar base.
That's the crucial point. For the professional class, maybe cheaper imported goods from free trade were nice. Maybe access to global talent via H-1B helped their industries. Maybe financial deregulation fueled the stock market where their retirement savings were. Their economic interests, in many ways, aligned with the New Democrat program.
So the party effectively traded bases, gaining educated suburbanites while losing industrial workers.
That's a stark way to put it, but yeah, the sources suggest something like that happened. They built a new coalition where the economic interests of the acquired base were served by the very policies that alienated the traditional base.
Which sounds potentially unstable in the long run?
Exactly. It created this inherent tension, this vulnerability. It arguably opened the door for later populist movements on both the left and the right to appeal to that sense of economic grievance, that feeling of being left behind by the party that used to champion them. The Democrats won the center, but maybe fractured their own foundation in the process.
And those final data points you mentioned earlier really drive it home.
Yeah, looking back at the end of the Clinton era, around 2000, union density down to 15%. Welfare caseloads slashed by over 60%. Those are huge structural shifts.
Compared to the minimum wage just getting up to $5.15?
Right. It highlights the difference in scale. The concessions were real, but they were dwarfed by the fundamental reorientation of the economic and social policy architecture towards market principles. And we didn't even delve deeply into financial deregulation, but things like the repeal of Glass-Steagall in '99.
Separating commercial and investment banking.
Right, repealing that was another major piece, reinforcing the financial sector's influence and aligning with that neoliberal trend. It's all part of the same pattern. Hashtag tag outro. So when you put all the evidence together from the sources, the conclusion seems pretty clear. The Clinton years really do represent this deep, deliberate, and quite durable shift in the Democratic Party's identity towards the center, heavily influenced by neoliberal ideas.
And it leaves this complex legacy, doesn't it? On one hand, you have a period of significant economic growth, budget surpluses, relative peace, presided over by Clinton.
Absolutely. The 90s were prosperous for many.
But on the other hand, the sources argue that the structural changes made during that time in trade, in finance, in welfare policy systematically chipped away at the economic security and bargaining power of large segments of the American working class. And that created a political consensus around these neoliberal ideas that lasted for decades in both parties.
And the fact that the infrastructure built then organizations like the Progressive Policy Institute, the whole centrist mindset still plays a major role in the party today, suggests this wasn't just a temporary blip. It was a real lasting realignment.
Which leads us to that final thought, that provocative question for you, the listener, to consider. If the whole reason for this big shift, the justification given by the DLC and New Democrats, was electoral necessity, we have to win back the middle class by being market-friendly.
Right, if that was the foundational logic.
Then what does it mean for the party's future, now that the consequences of that shift, the economic divisions, the feeling of abandonment among working-class voters, are themselves creating huge political instability and deep polarization?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? The schism this shift created is still playing out. Can a party built on that third-way coalition ultimately hold together when the economic interests of its professional wing seem so often at odds with the needs of the working-class voters it now desperately wants or needs to win back? That tension seems to be the enduring challenge left by this whole era.
Definitely something to think about. Thanks for digging deep with us today.